He was just a poor black kid, helping a stranger. He had no idea. That man was a billionaire about to rewrite his destiny. What if I told you? A boy with dust-covered sneakers and no money in his pocket changed the destiny of a millionaire in under 10 minutes. What if I told you? One flat tire in the middle of nowhere sparked a chain reaction that would flip the power dynamic between wealth and wisdom. This isn't a fairy tale. This happened. And what you're about to witness isn't just a good deed. It's the moment when humility collided with forgotten humanity and lit a fire in a man who thought he'd seen it all. Stay until the end, because by the time this story finishes, you won't be the same person who clicked play. Douglas Whitmore, a wealthy man in his late 70s, sat alone in his silver Mercedes, tapping his thumb impatiently against the steering wheel. The air conditioner hummed, barely keeping the Kentucky heat at bay. Retired and wealthy from a life in finance, Douglas was used to things working in his favor. But that day he found himself stranded with a flat tire far from the comforts of his pristine mansion on the outskirts of town. After a few attempts to call for roadside assistance with no luck, he sighed and resigned himself to the fact that he'd have to wait. Just as frustration began to bubble up, he saw a figure walking toward him down the road. A young boy, maybe 13 or 14, wearing a faded t-shirt and worn-out sneakers, approached with a determined expression. Douglas watched as the boy's eyes narrowed, examining the car, before giving Douglas a polite but confident nod. "Got a flat, sir?" the boy asked, his voice steady. Yes, I do," Douglas replied, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. "I was hoping for a bit of help, but my phone's got no signal out here." The boy gave a little smile. "I can help with that," he said, kneeling beside the tire without hesitation. "My grandpa taught me how to change a tire last summer. Do you have a spare?" Douglas gestured to the trunk, watching as the boy Malik Carter opened it and pulled out the necessary tools. Malik worked swiftly, his hands moving with quiet confidence that seemed almost beyond his years. As Douglas stood there, a strange humility crept in, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He wanted to offer the boy something in return, but Malik hardly looked up, focusing intently on the task at hand. After a few minutes, the boy finished wiping his hands on his jeans and stepping back. "All done," he said simply, offering a small, satisfied smile. Douglas reached into his wallet and pulled out a few bills, holding them out. "Here, take this. I really appreciate your help." But Malik took a step back, raising his hand politely. "Thank you, sir, but I don't need anything. Just happy to help." Stunned, Douglas stood there, money still in hand, watching the boy turn and walk away down the road. The interaction left him deeply moved, though he couldn't quite put a finger on why. Alone now, he slipped the money back into his wallet and got back into his car, watching in the rearview mirror as Malik's figure grew smaller in the distance. For the rest of his drive, Douglas's thoughts kept drifting back to Malik. There was a quiet dignity about him, a self-assurance that wasn't born from money or privilege, but from something far deeper. That night, as he sat alone in his lavish home, Douglas couldn't shake the image of Malik walking away with nothing but a smile. In the leather armchair of his study, surrounded by shelves of books he rarely opened, Douglas let the soft ticking of the grandfather clock fill the silence. His dinner, a perfectly prepared steak and asparagus, sat untouched. Thousands of people had passed through Douglas's life, partners, investors, employees, and always there was an exchange, a deal, a favor, a gain. But Malik Carter, that boy had helped him for no reason at all. He leaned back, sipping his scotch, the boy's confident smile replaying in his mind. The worn shoes, the faded clothes, the dust on his hands, it all told a story. And yet Malik carried himself with a kind of grace that seemed almost extinct. The next morning, Douglas couldn't resist the urge to find him. He drove down the same road, asking around at gas stations, small diners, and cafes. Hours passed until finally an older woman behind a cafe counter said, "Sounds like you're talking about Malik. He's always helping folks around here. Lives with his mama over in Harlan." Douglas drove to Harlan, a quiet town nestled in the Appalachians. Locals pointed him to a small house on the edge of town. The house was worn but tidy with a sagging porch. Douglas parked, hesitated, then knocked on the door. A woman in her early 40s answered. She looked tired but kind, her eyes sharp with curiosity. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Good morning," Douglas said, clearing his throat. "I believe I met your son yesterday. Malik, right? He helped me with a flat tire." Her expression softened. "That sounds like my Malik," she said with a small smile. "He's always helping folks." "I just wanted to thank him properly," Douglas said. "He wouldn't accept anything from me." "He's out back. You're welcome to wait." Inside, Douglas took in the modest surroundings, clean lived-in, full of warmth. He followed Tanya Carter out to the yard where Malik was repairing a fence. "Hey, mister," Malik said, wiping his hands. "What are you doing here?" Douglas smiled. "I wanted to thank you again. You helped me when I really needed it, and I haven't stopped thinking about it." Malik shrugged. It wasn't a big deal. "But it was to me," Douglas said, voice thick with emotion. "People don't help strangers like that anymore." Malik tilted his head. "If someone needs help and I can do it, why wouldn't I?" Douglas looked around at the yard, the patched fence, the old swing set. The boy's life was clearly not easy, yet his heart was wide open. "Your mother must be proud," Douglas said. Malik grinned. "She works hard. I just try to help." Douglas fell silent, reflecting on his own past, his own forgotten values. "I'd like to do something for you and your family," he said. "We're okay, mister. We don't need anything. It's not about need, it's about what's right." Just then, Tanya called out from the porch. "Malik wash up before lunch. Would you care to join us, mister? It's nothing fancy." Douglas hesitated, unused to such kindness, but the sincerity in her voice melted his hesitation. "I'd like that." In the kitchen, surrounded by mismatched chairs and the smell of fresh bread, Douglas listened as Malik talked about school friends and dreams of becoming an engineer. Tanya spoke with quiet pride. Douglas was captivated. This home was filled with something his mansion lacked: joy. After lunch, he said to Tanya, "You've done a remarkable job. He's got more heart than most men I know." "Thank you," she said. "We've learned to appreciate the small things." Douglas left their home with a sense of purpose. The next morning, he made calls. Contractors, colleagues. Within a week, trucks and workers showed up at the Carters' home. Tanya's voice trembled. "You didn't have to do this. You've thrived with so little. Let me give something back." As Malik watched the work eyes wide, Douglas knelt beside him. "You reminded me that helping people isn't about money. It's about showing up. I want to show up for you." The porch was rebuilt. The swing set replaced, the house repainted, a home reborn. "Your job," Douglas said, smiling, "is to enjoy being a kid." But Malik couldn't resist learning. One worker, Mr. Reggie Dawson, let him help measure planks. Soon, Malik was asking questions, curious and bright. Douglas watched it all with a pride that made his heart ache. One evening, Tanya said softly, "You've given us hope, and I think you found something too." "I have," Douglas replied. This is what matters." As the sun set, Malik said, "Mr. Douglas, I want to help people too. Like you did." Douglas rested a hand on his shoulder. "You already are." The story ended where it began, with a simple act of kindness from a young boy who expected nothing and changed everything. Because sometimes when you help someone, you don't just change their day, you change their life and your own. A few weeks after the last nail had been hammered and the final coat of paint had dried life in one afternoon, Malik burst through the front door. "Mom!" he shouted, breathless. "Guess what? My science teacher picked me to represent the school in the regional STEM competition, Tanya C." He nodded, beaming. She grabbed a towel, dried her hands, and pulled him into a hug. That evening, Malik sat at Tanya, opened it, smiling. "Douglas Afi, He stepped in holding a brown paper bag filled with fresh pastries. Perfect timing. Tanya laughed. He just told me he's going to the regional science fair. Douglas raised his eyebrows and looked to Malik, stood holding up his sketches. I want to build. Douglas walked over Stu. I want to help people. Douglas nodded slowly. Then we better make sure you have the tools you need. That weekend, Douglas returned with a portable drafting table, new pencils, a set of engineering guides, and a laptop with design software. It wasn't just generosity. In the weeks leading up to the fair, Malik and Douglas worked side by side every Saturday. The boy's curiosity became unstoppable, and Douglas found himself feeling something he hadn't in years: hope. On the day of the regional competition, Tanya stood beside Douglas in the audience, clutching her purse and beaming with pride as Malik presented his project to a panel of judges. When they called his name as the first-place winner, the room erupted in applause. But it wasn't the trophy that mattered. It was the moment Douglas looked at Tanya and said, "Your boy's going to change the world," and she smiled through tears. He already changed ours. A week after the science fair, Douglas Whitmore found himself pacing in his study. The joy of watching Malik win hadn't worn off. It had only grown louder in his chest. He wasn't sleeping much, but not out of stress. It was something else. Purpose. He opened his laptop and began typing furiously. By the time the sun peeked over the horizon, the first draft of something entirely new sat on his screen. The Carter Initiative, empowering young minds through community and STEM. It wasn't just about funding science kits or school programs. It was about building access, real, tangible pipelines for kids like Malik, who didn't just dream, but dared to build. He picked up the phone. "Jacqueline, it's Douglas. I need a team. Legal educational consultants, outreach coordinators, the works. I'm starting something." By the end of the month, the Carter Initiative had a logo, a mission statement, and backing from 3 major donors thanks to Douglas's network. But Malik's story was the heartbeat. At a local community center, a modest press conference was held. Malik stood nervously behind the podium, his small hands barely above the mic. "I never thought changing a tire would change my life," he said, his voice clear but trembling. "I helped Mr. Whitmore that day because my mama taught me to be kind, and he helped me believe I could build something bigger." The crowd applauded, many with tears in their eyes. Behind him, Tanya Carter clasped her hands to her mouth, overwhelmed. Douglas stepped forward next. "There are thousands of Maliks out there," he said, voice steady. "This initiative is for them, for the kids no one sees until they shine so bright they can't be ignored." What began as a flat tire on a dusty road was now a movement. Schools began reaching out. Other kids, quiet, brilliant, often overlooked, started submitting ideas. The Carter Initiative began mentoring funding and connecting young innovators with real-world opportunities. Back in Harlan, life was still simple, but there was something different now. Mail arrived addressed to Malik Carter, future engineer. Local papers called him a hometown hero. And Tanya, she now led community events inspired by Douglas's faith in her son and in her. One evening, Douglas sat on the new front porch with Tanya and Malik, sipping sweet tea and watching the stars come out. "Do you think," Malik asked, eyes on the sky, "we could ever build a shelter on the moon?" Douglas chuckled. "With you leading the way, I'd bet my last dollar on it." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that only settles between people who know they've changed each other's lives. This wasn't charity. This was legacy. 3 years later, the Carter Initiative had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started in a modest town in Kentucky now reached schools in 7 states. There were innovation hubs named after Malik Carter, each filled with 3D printers, solar kits, and robotics labs buzzing with young, curious minds. The story of a boy helping a man on the side of the road had become a case study in national leadership seminars. A documentary was even in production. But Malik. He was still just Malik, only taller, sharper, and more focused than ever. Now 17, Malik stood inside the Carter STEM lab at East Harlan High. The walls were lined with framed photos of student projects and newspaper clippings of former alumni. But at the center of the room was a prototype, a compact solar-powered filtration system he'd designed for communities without clean water. He had been selected as one of 5 finalists in the National Future Innovators Challenge. Washington, D.C. was next. As Malik adjusted the sensors on his prototype, Douglas Whitmore stepped into the lab. "You ready for the big leagues?" Douglas asked with a smile. Malik turned and grinned. "Born ready." Douglas walked over and examined the setup. "Is this the latest version?" "Yes, sir." "Lighter, more efficient. It filters double the volume now." Douglas nodded, clearly impressed, but then his voice dropped a bit. "Malik, I didn't tell you this yet, but the Department of Energy is sending a rep to the finals. They're scouting for youth partners for a national clean water program." Malik's eyes widened. "You think I have a shot?" Douglas looked him square in the eye. "You're not just a shot, son. You're the blueprint." Later that week, under the bright lights of a D.C. conference center, Malik stood on stage before an audience of scientists, CEOs, and policy leaders. He didn't stammer. He didn't shrink. He told them about growing up with patchy water pressure and rust in the pipes, about helping an old man with a flat tire and getting a lesson in legacy, and about how ideas are only as strong as the people willing to invest in them. The room stood in applause. Afterward, Douglas watched from the sidelines as a line of executives and officials formed to shake Malik's hand. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Because that day, Malik Carter didn't just present a science project. He stepped into his future. And for Douglas, seeing that was the greatest return on investment he had ever made. 6 months later, an invitation beyond borders. Malik Carter sat at the edge of the airstrip in Nairobi, Kenya, his prototype filtration unit secured beside him, now labeled with a tiny engraved plate, Carter Pure Model 1. Behind him, engineers loaded crates of equipment into jeeps, bound for a remote village hours away, one that hadn't seen clean drinking water in over a decade. He had been invited by Global Aid Tech, a humanitarian organization that had seen his presentation in D.C. and immediately reached out with a bold offer: "Come test your invention where it matters most in the field." Malik was now 18, just graduated high school. No suit, no headlines, no safety net. Just a boy from Harlan, Kentucky who had once helped change a tire and now stood poised to help change lives. Douglas Whitmore was back in Kentucky watching through satellite feed on his laptop, tears brimming in his eyes. At the village of Kasinga, the response was overwhelming. Women cheered. Children danced barefoot in the red dust. Elders wept openly as the clean water poured steadily into jerry cans from Malik's unit for the first time. "I didn't think this would happen in my lifetime," one man whispered in Swahili. Malik didn't understand the words, but he didn't have to. The expression on their faces was enough. That night, under an endless sky dotted with stars, Malik wrote in his journal, "It's not about how far you can go, it's about how deeply you can reach. These people didn't need a hero. They just needed to be seen, and I needed to remember why I started." When Malik returned to the U.S., news had already broken. CNN picked it up. So did the UN Development Program. Offers came flooding in Harvard, MIT, and Howard all extended full scholarships. One even proposed funding the full development and mass production of Carter Pure for international deployment. But Malik wasn't chasing the next shiny thing. He picked up the phone and called Douglas. "I want to go back," Malik said. "But this time, I want to bring students with me." Douglas paused. Then his voice broke into a laugh. "You're not building a company, Malik. You're building a movement." 1 year later, the world watches. The auditorium was silent. Not because people weren't interested, but because every soul in the room was holding their breath. The screen behind him read only one word: enough. Malik Carter stepped up to the podium at the United Nations Youth Innovation Summit in Geneva, Switzerland. The room was packed: diplomats, CEOs, educators, and thousands of young leaders from across the world. He didn't speak like a billionaire. He didn't read off a teleprompter. He simply looked out over the sea of faces and began. 1 year ago, I helped a man on the side of the road. I didn't know who he was. I didn't do it for a reward. I did it because someone needed help, and I had hands. A murmur of recognition passed through the audience. Cameras flashed. Since then, I've built clean water systems in 7 countries. I've trained over 100 young engineers. And I've done it without a trust fund, without an Ivy League degree, and without waiting for permission. He paused, looking directly into the camera. So to every young person watching this, if you've been told that your background is a limitation, that your age is a weakness, or that your kindness isn't real-world enough, I'm here to say, they're wrong. Empathy is innovation, and your story is your superpower. Applause erupted like thunder, not polite claps, but standing ovation thunder. Later that night, backstage, Malik sat alone in the green room, his speech notes crumpled in his hand. His phone buzzed. A text from Elijah, his mentee from Harlan, now starting an apprenticeship in electrical engineering. You made us believe. I'm going to be better than you one day. Watch me. Malik smiled through tears. Not sadness, not pride, hope. Because now he wasn't just building solutions. He was building legacy. 5 years later, a new beginning. The morning sun spilled across the campus of Carter Institute for Applied Sciences, a new state-of-the-art technical college nestled in the heart of Harlan. The once-forgotten Appalachian town had transformed, buzzing now, with students from all over the country drawn by the promise of purpose, not prestige. At the front gate stood a bronze statue. It was simple but powerful, a boy holding a wrench in one hand and extending the other to help someone up. The plaque read, "To those who help without asking why, you're already changing the world." Inside the lecture hall, Elijah Bennett, no longer a curious teenager, but a young man with bright eyes and calloused hands, adjusted his microphone. He was now Director of Student Innovation, and today was his first address to the incoming class. He looked over the packed auditorium, a lump rising in his throat. Just 5 years ago, he was patching fences in his backyard. Now he stood here as a symbol of what belief and opportunity could build. "My name is Elijah," he began, steady but full of feeling. "And I'm not here because I had money. I'm here because someone saw me. Because a man named Malik Carter stopped long enough to ask not what I could give him, but what I might become." The students leaned forward. "So I ask all of you, who will you see? Who will you lift up next? Because talent doesn't always walk in with a polished resume. Sometimes it shows up in worn sneakers and a willing heart." A tear rolled down his mother's cheek from the front row. She wasn't used to grand speeches, but she was used to watching her son rise. As the room exploded in applause, Elijah smiled to himself. This wasn't about fame. It wasn't even about gratitude. It was about continuing the chain. In a quiet moment, later that evening, Elijah stood in his office staring out over the town. A photo hung behind his desk, him and Malik both grinning, sweaty from construction work, standing under the old swing set that had once leaned so crooked. And below it, written in neat script, were the words Malik had once said, "Helping people isn't about money. It's about showing up." And now Elijah knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Later that month, a knock at the door. One quiet Saturday morning, Elijah was tightening a bolt on one of the campus's new solar panels when he heard a knock at his office door. It was a young boy, maybe 11, nervous, holding a torn notepad, his shoes muddy, his hair wild from the wind. Mr. Bennett," the boy said, barely above a whisper. "They told me you might talk to me about engineering." Elijah stood slowly, brushing the dust from his hands. "What's your name, Tobias, sir?" "Well, Tobias," Elijah said with a warm smile, "you just stepped into the right place." He led him into the workshop where pieces of disassembled drones, mechanical parts, and whiteboards full of equations filled the space. Tobias's eyes lit up. Elijah recognized that look. It was the same look he once had when he helped fix a flat tire for a stranger and had no idea that moment would change everything. "Ever used a soldering iron?" Elijah asked. Tobias shook his head. "Want to learn? Yes." "Please," he said, barely containing his grin. As Elijah handed the boy his first circuit board, he whispered, "Doesn't matter where you come from, kid. What matters is what you build." Across town, Malik Carter stood quietly at a dedication ceremony hidden in the back. He hadn't expected his name to be on the institute. That wasn't why he helped. But when the mayor called him to the podium, he walked forward, slowly touched beyond words. "I didn't plan to leave a legacy," he said softly into the microphone. "But sometimes when you show kindness to one person, they show it to thousands." He looked over at Elijah, who stood beside Tobias, now beaming like a lighthouse for the next generation. Malik nodded. "And that's the kind of wealth no bank account can hold." The audience rose to their feet. Applause, tears, hope. And far above them all, engraved into the arch over the Institute's entrance, read the words, "It all began with one act of kindness." 12 months passed. The house Elijah once lived in was now not only beautifully renovated, but had become a community hub. Locals called it the Beacon House, a place where kids could come after school, where meals were shared, and where hope had a front porch. Elijah's mother, now Ms. Ayanna Bennett, had started hosting weekend workshops for parents in the area, everything from budgeting to family cooking nights. The laughter that once seemed so rare now echoed through those walls daily. And Elijah. He had become more than just the boy who changed a tire. He had become a local icon of possibility. With Malik's ongoing mentorship and support, Elijah earned a full scholarship to a top engineering academy. But instead of leaving town, he chose to stay part-time and return to Harlan every week to teach robotics and mentor kids who, like him, had big dreams but few resources. One evening, as he walked out of the Beacon House, he found Malik leaning against the new gate, watching him with pride. "You ever think," Malik said quietly, "that all this came from one little moment?" Elijah chuckled. "Sometimes I think about that tire every single day." They stood there for a while in comfortable silence, the street lamp casting warm amber light across the porch steps. Then Elijah turned, looking Malik in the eye. "You changed my life." Malik shook his head slowly. "No, son. You just needed a spark. The fire was already inside you. They embraced like father and son, no need for more words. What if I told you? A boy with dust-covered sneakers and no money in his pocket changed the destiny of a millionaire in under 10 minutes. What if I told you? One flat tire in the middle of nowhere sparked a chain reaction that would flip the power dynamic between wealth and wisdom. This isn't a fairy tale. This happened.